Outriders is a game I had zero expectation of when I sat down to play it. I wasn't looking to sink 60 hours into it for a review, I wasn't expecting to grind it for the platinum I eventually got, and I absolutely wasn't expecting to mark my calendar for Worldslayer, the game's first major content release in over a year. If you were to tell me it would hook me with its chaotic and brilliantly designed gameplay loop, where it perfectly harmonizes 4 classes, each with their own unique setup that would overlap and play perfectly together, that my loadout can have deep customization options with mods on my weapons and gear, that would drastically alter not only my gameplay, but my teammates' gameplay as well, that out of all of the looter shooters I've played over the years, that this would be the one I want to come back to, not only on my own, but with friends. I would absolutely not have believed you, of course I wouldn't. But to understand why I find Outriders so good, we need to start in a more familiar place. Destiny is a game that has breathtaking art direction, a game feel that is almost second to none, and quality content that keeps players coming back week after week. With the rise of World of Warcraft in the mid-2000s, studios were trying to solve the MMO problem on console for more than a decade, all of which failed until Bungie came along with Destiny. This is nothing new to Bungie, of course. They solved the multiplayer problem on console back in 2004 with Halo 2, and simply making console shooters feel good in 2001 with Halo Combat Evolved. Some studios are praised for their continued brilliance, like a Naughty Dog or Insomniac, but Bungie is in a class almost of its own. They produce games that are not only great in and of themselves, but are so groundbreaking they shift the course of gaming as a whole. To put it plainly, I think only id Software and Blizzard comes close in terms of industry impact over such a long period of time. Why is that intro so important? Well, if you're looking at Outriders or the developers People Can Fly to replace that in some way, or to find something comparable that's just newer, I'm going to say you're out of luck. That said, I think Outriders is substantially better than Destiny in so many ways, but one very, very specific way shines the brightest for me. When I sit down to play Outriders, I know what the I'm doing. Give me like 60 seconds to be a UI UX nerd and just rant about Destiny so you understand how People Can Fly have nailed a core part of Outriders that players don't even really think about when they sit down to sink hours into a game. Destiny 2 is an awful game at onboarding not only new players but returning players. I've jumped back on Destiny a few times over the years, most recently with the Witch Queen, and when I got back to that famous UI, the one synonymous with Destiny, the one that has inspired endless copies in and out of the genre, I felt so overwhelmed and drained with decisions. Not only with how many things there are to do, but the uncertainty and confusion that follows with what is laid out in front of me, not knowing what does and doesn't hold value for my time. I wouldn't be shocked if some of the comments to this video are from players who have tried Destiny for that looter shooter experience and just gave up. There are 2 user experience principles that make Outriders a more digestible, understandable, and therefore better gaming experience in my opinion. Hick's Law is the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and complexity of choices. Miller's Law is the average person can only keep around 7 items in their working memory. Keep those 2 things in mind and look at this, even with a glance. Without even getting into the amount of vendors, economics, in-game prompts, story moments that have been added and removed from the experience of Destiny 2 over the years, resource and item juggling, along with the resources that veteran players will tell you don't matter. Don't pick up that, leave that, this is good, that's broken. It's so obnoxiously overwhelming to a returning player, never mind a new player. I mean, what is this? What does this icon mean? What is this pop-up? Why is that flashing? This looks like a friend icon, but I know I have no friends online right now. Now this thing's flashing? Like, it's this level of frustration that made me look for a new looter shooter in the first place. One that didn't feel like a part-time job, and certainly one that didn't require getting a more experienced Destiny friend to walk me through. I wanted a game that didn't spend its time getting in my way. I wanted a fresh start with a game that respected my time. In that respect, Outriders is absolutely a game you should be playing, or at least giving a try if you can. It isn't strictly live service, so the comparison to Destiny isn't exactly one-to-one, but the gameplay loop and looter shooter that People Can Fly have put together here is some of the most enjoyable third-person action I've experienced. They have drawn from both their Gears of War and Bulletstorm experience to hit their own personal home run with a game that has been flying criminally low under the radar for more than a year now. Let's do it, a 2022 review of Outriders. Okay, so it's important to address something head on. The network and tech issues Outriders faced during its release window were not experienced in my 60+ hours with the game. My 60 hours included a mostly solo story playthrough, playing with friends, joining randoms, letting randoms join me, and a both solo and multiplayer endgame grind. You are safe to jump into this game in 2022. Outriders almost nails its pacing out of the gate. It lets you explore a surprisingly satisfying yet simple character creation that feels like a middle ground, aesthetically speaking, between Destiny and The Division, before dropping you into the early days of humanity discovering Enoch, the world in which Outriders takes place. It's here you learn the early mechanics of your campsite, multiple characters and their purposes at the camp, as well as setting your expectations of how the game will play out. Every new area in Enoch you eventually explore will have you start at a campsite and explore outwards, usually with a linear path in mind with occasional opportunities to explore further with side missions and whatnot. It's in these early moments of the game where it feeds you the story of Outriders. It's pretty basic, global warming equals new planet, go explore. For the first 20 minutes, it felt really bland and unimaginative. You learn basic mechanics while you explore this lush, green, airy environment. It feels new and untouched by civilization, but ultimately I felt deflated thinking like, this is where I'm going to spend the next 50 hours? But then with a very early twist, the tutorial ends. Your Outrider is thrown into cryosleep to awaken 30 years later to a substantially more interesting world. I found then that the next 7 to 10 hours of Outriders was incredibly gripping. I was legitimately invested in characters and their motivations, how people had changed in those 30 years, even with only knowing them for a few scenes prior. I was curious to explore and understand how we went from a new horizon for humanity to a war zone with warring factions and superhumans wandering around. There was plenty to take in, but by contrast, your Outrider will run headfirst into the custom character issue that games can run into all too often. To appeal to everyone, they have this almost neutral sense on every topic. The right solution to this is making the character have a constant sense of dryness to the world around them, only breaking occasionally in the early stages of the game, rarely showing emotion, but ultimately in a way I couldn't help but find funny and a little endearing. This character trait seems to dry off pretty quickly, as there's early scenes where you see the barbarity of Enoch. They'll want to help as many people as possible, but the world around them, both narratively and through gameplay, refuses to allow it. One common theme throughout is that your hero just kind of knows they're the main character, and I get it, it's a power fantasy, Destiny has its Guardians, Division has its Agents, Outriders has its Outriders. It works, right up until it really doesn't. I said I was hooked for around 10 hours, but the Outriders main story is not 10 hours. When I got about halfway through the main campaign, I ultimately started skipping scenes and barely listened. Things just start to feel a little forgettable and predictable. That would be a problem in most other games, but I suspect you're here more for the looter shooter than the narrative, and I think most players looking for that experience won't see this as much of a downside for Outriders. For what it's worth, the story absolutely holds together, and despite me tuning out, I knew where I was in the story just by watching. I knew what was happening at all times. I never felt lost or misplaced. It was always easy to jump in and jump out and still feel those emotional beats the game tries to deliver. The narrative holds your hand long enough to let the gameplay kick in and carry you the rest of the way. So if you're someone who needs that narrative hook in a game, then I think you'll be more than satisfied with the story that's told here. It was more interesting than The Division, so if you're looking for a measuring stick, that's a good place to start. And that's sort of Outriders' constant state. While never really doing anything groundbreaking, it often finds itself doing a better job than most games on the market, almost across the board entirely. More importantly, it does it while never stumbling or falling apart. The area where this game absolutely should be falling apart, however, is its gameplay loop. This is why you're here and People Can Fly know it. It's why in the intro to this review I said I will absolutely be coming back for the Worldslayer DLC. They managed to juggle so much in terms of gunplay abilities, both passive and active, a deep mod systems on guns and gear, skill trees where you feel a tangible difference that matter in a fight along with the 4 classes, the Devastator, the Pyro, the Techno, and the Trickster. The variety Outriders offers really is brilliant, and I'm going to go on a limb here and say it is in a league of its own. I was really worried jumping into the game because I'm someone who gets easily overwhelmed with stats and figures, and I always feel like my build is weak, but Outriders has this feeling where everything you try is effective. The game reads so well. I think part of this is down to its Doom approach to combat, where to be effective, you need to be in the fight, and because of that, every class, every loadout feels worthwhile. The only way you're going to regain health in this game is dealing damage and killing, so there's always the incentive to be using your abilities, swapping weapons, trying things, using your ultimate. This means that the game is always feeding you. It's really enjoyable 30 to 60 second gameplay loop, over and over and over again. It speaks volumes at how confident Outriders is in itself. It isn't scared to make you repeat its loop. During my first playthrough, after waking up from the cryo sleep after the tutorial, I decided to pick the Technomancer class, and this is really important here. I get a kick out of playing support builds. Feel free to roast me in the comments, I know I'm weird like that. But I never once felt bored or underutilized in the game, playing with people or on my own. I didn't feel underpowered, which can happen all too often with support classes. In the looter shooters I've played, this is the one where I truly felt part of a team, where my input, however I decided to give it, was valuable. I absolutely don't doubt there are optimal builds in this game, especially when it comes to Outriders Endgame, Expeditions, but if this is potentially your first looter shooter, or you want a breath of fresh air in the genre, or you just want a really good third-person action game, I really like Outriders' ability to let you play your way and have a tangible impact from start to finish, on your own or with a team. I just never felt lost in this game, apart from minor bugs. From tweaking my character to reworking weapon mods on my gun, to moving through the world itself. Outriders always manages to keep me engaged, not by being simple, but by being approachable. Weapon mods are easy to understand, apply, and use. The world itself operates on a world tier system that is basically difficulty. At any point you can lower it or raise it, and it just makes the game feel so much better with its flexibility it offers to new players. The layers that Outriders builds with its gameplay loop, its classes, skill trees, and weapon mods, crescendos with excellent enemy encounters, as well as enjoyable boss fights known as Altered. Outriders really shines when it decides to throw multiple enemies at you at once. Mini-bosses, close range, long range, enemies that rush, enemies that hide. People Can Fly really looked at their contribution to Gears of War and wondered how they could dial it up to 11. The gameplay loop they have put together here, I cannot stress enough, it is one of the best. It is really enjoyable. Kudos to the team. Now, no environment was bad by any means, but the early levels felt bigger with some world building, where the later areas felt really flushed out both thematically and visually, but I was never around long enough to enjoy them. So there's this really weird contrast. This contrast is compounded when we talk about your truck and campsite. They're your primary way to move around Enoch as a whole, and you transition pretty heavily from spending a large chunk of time in an environment that is, again, not that well flushed out, and it doesn't really feel that impactful. It feels very generic, only coming back to your truck and campsite a few times in so many hours, to the layer areas where you basically use it as a glorified bus. You hop on it, it's a loading screen, you kill a thing, you go back, and then you go to a new place. This isn't just a review thing either. This didn't pop up when looking over my notes and thinking, how did I feel about that? I felt it in the moment. I really felt like, oh, we're leaving already? This whole area feels unexplored, untouched, and we're just leaving. So you really do spend a lot of time in the earlier environments, and the nice areas of the game, you just kind of rush through. That said, I do really like the camp system, and it is not at fault here. Being able to go back to my personal traveling circus whenever I need to upgrade weapons, sell scrap, ask questions, do anything basically. It removed a huge mental burden that I think a lot of players would have with this type of game. I never had to remember where anything was because it was always there with me. And thematically, I was able to feel closer to the characters because they traveled with me. Where I went, they went. What I dealt with, they dealt with. In other looter shooters, you seemingly disappear, like thematically speaking. You disappear for months at a time to return to someone who, for all intents and purposes, is a stranger. They've just sent you off to do something, or they're some sort of vendor. I have no sense of this person existing outside of their gamified role, where Outriders merges both character progression with a function. And without spoiling anything, people come and go in the campsite, but its functions remain. I wish more games did this. It works really well and always ensures you have a strong sense of placement in the world. There's no surprising vendors really, or traveling across worlds to get the right vendor or the thing you need to do for that moment. People Can Fly could have absolutely padded the 30-hour campaign by making you constantly backtrack to shops and other vendors, but this traveling circus in the form of a campsite is absolutely perfect. I mentioned before that the crescendo of Outriders is in its gameplay loop, layering everything together and holding firm and never breaking. Multiple enemy types, tiered weapon mods, a variety of weapons and gear and upgrades, skill trees that have multiple choices among multiple classes, all in harmony together. Outriders recognizes that and takes its best parts and lets you loose in Expeditions. This part of the game only unlocks at the end, and it is Outriders' reason to come back. You get the best loot, you meet the dedicated players, you see players working together in the best ways. It's all here and it's absolutely brilliant. It's arguably where Outriders is at its best. Sadly, because of the low player count and how the game's done over the last year, it's something players might not ever get to see. But if you stick with this game, you are absolutely rewarded in the end game. It's very enjoyable. This is a game I honestly didn't expect to love. It's a game that embraces chaos and designs with it in mind. It's a game that encourages you to try different builds, play it the way you want to do it. Nothing feels redundant or useless here. Everything has its place and time, both solo or multiplayer. It manages to be a great looter shooter experience. When I moved on to my next game for review, I kept having this itch that I just wanted one more run in Expedition, that there's just never a bad sign in a game. Wanting to be pulled back into it in a well-designed, curated world of chaotic fun and creativity among classes. The story might be hit or miss for some people, but the core game that People Can Fly have built here is absolutely something worth building on, it is something worth playing, and it is something worth giving a try. I really hope Worldslayer gets more people interested in this game, and I look forward to seeing you in it if you do. I hope you enjoyed the review. I'll see you in the comments.